But we're in our third part of our series called Heart Exposed. We're looking at the life of David and pulling out the songs that he wrote called Psalms and getting his heart as he went through life's experiences. So this is the third in that lesson. Any of you ever heard of this popular song? This was real popular during my childhood when I was like a teenager. The old Leary legend. Nobody, John remembers it. Anybody else? Real popular song. It went like this: late one night when we were all in bed, Mrs. O'Leary lit a lantern in the shed. The cow kicked it over, then winked her eye and said, "There'll be a hot time in the old town tonight." Anybody remember that song? This is good. Anybody know where this song came from?
Chicago Fire.
Exactly, 1871, during my teenage years. 1871, you're welcome, David. 1871, Chicago. You know the story. The summer of 1871, it was a very hot, dry, drought year. It left the ground parched everywhere in the Midwest. Chicago was almost entirely built out of wooden. All the buildings were built out of wood. And on Sunday evening, October the 8th, 1871, just about 9 o'clock, a fire broke out in the barn behind the house of Patrick and Catherine O'Leary at 13 Coleman Street. And how the fire started has never been quite settled, but O'Leary's cow gets credit. Therefore, the O'Leary legend song that I just showed you a moment ago. But the story was that the O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern, started a fire in the barn, and that got out of control. The firefighters were called. They were worn out from fighting a huge fire the day before, and they were sent to the wrong neighborhood. Some things never change. And when they finally arrived at the O'Learys, they found that the fire was simply raging out of control because it was so dry that year. The blaze quickly spread east and north, east toward Lake Michigan, north toward Wisconsin, and because all the structures are wooden houses, commercial buildings, industrial buildings, homes were just totally consumed by the fire as it raged across what is now known as downtown Chicago. It started raining 2 days later, which eventually put out the fire. But it left the city completely in devastation. This is the old Chicago. This is Lake Michigan. Here's the river that runs through downtown Chicago. All the part in red you see was burned to the ground. And just the city was completely devastated. At least 300 people died in the fire. 100,000 people were homeless. And about $200 million worth of 1871 value property was lost. The entire central business district of Chicago was leveled. This is an actual picture that appeared in the New York Times from downtown Chicago 2 days after the fire. There was an attorney who lived there, a very prosperous and successful attorney. His name was Horatio Spafford. He was a very devout Presbyterian when, frankly, being a Presbyterian meant a little something different than it probably does today. He was an elder, and he and his wife were very committed believers, and they were living very comfortably in Chicago with their 4 young daughters. Their son had contracted scarlet fever and died in 1871 at the age of 4. But he had invested a lot of his investments in a lot of his money in downtown Chicago, so when the city burned, he lost a huge portion of his estate. His son died about the same time as the Chicago fire at the age of 4. But for 2 years, Spafford, who, by the way, was a friend of the famous evangelist D.L. Moody. D.L. Moody and his song leader Ira Sankey were a generation ahead of Billy Graham and Cliff Barron's, but they did huge, massive crusades in America and especially in Europe back in the 1800s, and Spafford was one of his friends. This is a picture today, actually, well, not today, but current picture of the Moody Church in Chicago, and it was obviously named after D.L. Moody. And I had the privilege of standing in that pulpit several years ago. I was speaking in Chicago and had the chance to stand there and speak. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon and nobody was in the building but me, but I still had a chance to stand in D.L. Moody's pulpit. So that was a treat for somebody. But for 2 years after the fire, Spafford and his family worked hard to assist the homeless. They provided housing for people who lost their housing. And they worked almost nonstop and tirelessly for 2 years after the fire to help the people who were displaced by the fire. But after about 2 years, they decided to take a vacation And they decided to go to England, and where D.L. Moody and Ira Sankey were leading a crusade, and then they were going to take a few weeks after that to travel around England on vacation. But Spafford was delayed by some business, and I know that none of you wives ever had this happen to you, but Spafford was delayed by some business, so he sent his wife Anna, and that's a picture of Anna, and their 4 daughters, their children's governess, and then 2 other people who traveled in their party on ahead, and Spafford said that he'd catch up with them later when he could come to the other side of the Atlantic. But their ship, and my French is really rusty, mainly because it never existed, so I was trying to get my little French expert, Catherine, to help me with these names, but Ville de Havre, I think is how that's pronounced. The ship, the Ville de Havre, never made it to England. About 2 o'clock in the morning on November the 22nd, in the Eastern Atlantic, the Ville de Havre was rammed midship by a British iron clipper. The Ville de Havre sank in about 12 minutes, and 226 people died when the ship sank. Anna Spafford was picked up unconscious on a floating spar, but the 4 daughters, Anna, Maggie, and here are their pictures, Anna, Maggie, Bessie, and Tanetta, all drowned when the Ville de Havre sank. The Loch Arn, the British clipper ship, was seriously damaged, but was able to take on board the surviving 61 passengers and 29 surviving crew members. And among those, of course, were Anna Spafford and the governess, whose name was, pardon me, whose name was Emma Loriot. And the following day, the U.S. ship, Tremontaine, reached the scene and rescued the Ville de Havre passengers, and they were transferred from the Loch Arn on the Tremontaine, which then sailed to Wales and landed at Cardiff. Then on December the 1st, 1873, in Cardiff, Anna Spafford cabled her husband, and this is an actual copy of the telegram that he received, cabled her husband the following message, which read, "Saved alone. What shall I do? Mrs. Goodwin, children, Willie Culver, lost." Mrs. Goodwin and Willie Culver were the 2 parties, and then their children were all lost. And that is a copy of the telegram that Horatio Spafford received. So he took the next available ship to join his wife in Wales. And during that voyage, the captain of the ship called into the bridge and said a careful reckoning has been made, and he said, "I believe we're now passing over the place where the Ville de Havre was wrecked. The water here is about 3 miles deep." And that night, Horatio Spafford, obviously, for understandable reasons, couldn't sleep, and so in his cabin that night, he wrote on this piece of paper these words to the psalm that many of us know: "When peace like a river tendeth my way, when sorrow like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul."